demonstrated conclusively, through tool mark and context analysis published in the 1980s and 90s, that the tablets were carved with modern tools and buried in soil that did not match their supposed age. By then, several of the objects had already spent decades in private collections and small local museums, cited in books and pamphlets that kept circulating long after professional archaeology had rejected them, a reminder that a fabrication built to tell people what they already wanted to hear can outlive its own debunking by generations. The pattern was not unique to copper country. It ran through the mound builder debates of the Ohio Valley and the cliff-dwelling debates of the American Southwest during roughly the same decades, a recurring institutional habit of assigning American antiquity to almost anyone except the nations already standing on top of it. It took the 20th century's radiocarbon laboratories and archaeologists like Susan Martin, whose 1999 synthesis of the region's copper working record laid out the evidence for indigenous origin in full, not the 19th century's antiquarian societies, to confirm what Whittlesey had already argued in 1863 and what Ojibwe and Menominee oral tradition had never required a laboratory to establish in the first place. No single object captures that tension as completely as a boulder of native copper that once sat on the bank of the Ontonagon River, roughly a day's travel from where Whittlesey later conducted his survey. The trader Alexander Henry the Elder recorded seeing it in the 1760s, describing a mass so large that generations of travelers had chipped pieces from its surface with cold chisels and left the rest untouched. The Cass expedition, with the young ethnographer Henry Schoolcraft among its members, documented it again in 1820 and attempted without success to move it. Ojibwe accounts collected by Schoolcraft and by later observers described the boulder as something closer to a living presence than a mineral deposit, connected to the underwater spirit known across Ojibwe country as Mishibiju, guardian of the lake's depths and the copper within them. Taking copper from ground like this was never, in Ojibwe understanding, a purely mechanical act of extraction. It required acknowledgement of what was being taken, and from whom, and under what terms. In 1843, a Detroit businessman named Julius Eldred purchased a claim to the boulder, set aside Ojibwe objections to its removal, and spent months hauling nearly 2 tons of solid copper down to the riverbank on rollers and a windlass built specifically for the job. The boulder reached Detroit, then Washington, then a legal dispute that dragged on for years over who actually owned it. Once federal officials seized it from Eldred, on the grounds that the land it came from had never legally been his to sell in the first place. Congress eventually compensated Eldred for his trouble. The boulder itself passed first to the War Department and then, permanently, to the Smithsonian Institution, where it remains on public display in Washington today, a single physical object that carries the entire argument of this story inside its own chain of custody, known and named by people who understood exactly what it was and what it meant, taken over their stated objection, and absorbed into an institution that spent the following century treating the people who had known about it first as a footnote to the geology, rather than as its rightful authority. The dispute over the boulder dragged through federal courts for the better part of a decade, working its way through claims and counterclaims about mineral rights on land the United States had only recently pressured into cession, and it became, almost incidentally, one of the earlier tests of how far a private citizen's mining claim could reach against federal ownership of the ground beneath it. Nobody involved in the litigation, on either side of the case, called a single Ojibwe witness or entered a single Ojibwe objection into the court record, despite the fact that the entire dispute concerned an object whose history and significance had already been documented by the very ethnographer Schoolcraft, whose reports the federal government relied on for its own case. The boulder's legal history is, in that sense, a near-perfect miniature of the larger pattern, extensive paperwork generated by and for institutions, and total silence, in the official record, from the people the paperwork was actually about. The oral record kept better time than the institutions did. Ojibwe tradition describes a period of old copper people who worked this shoreline long before living memory. a detail ethnographers recorded independently across multiple communities decades before anyone thought to run a radiocarbon test on a hammerstone. The same tradition holds Mishibiju as more than a story figure, an underwater panther whose body Schoolcraft's informants described as sheathed in copper, painted and pecked into the cliff face at Agawa on the lake's Canadian shore in red ochre that has survived the weather for centuries, a warning as much as a record, marking the boundary of water that held both fish and something else. Schoolcraft, who married into an Ojibwe family and spent years recording testimony that most of his contemporaries dismissed outright as folklore, wrote down accounts of copper being mined, worked and traded across the lake during a period the tellers themselves placed in a distant, almost foundational past.